Deep beneath the sands of time lies a hidden web of global connection. This is the story of the forgotten trade networks that linked entire continents long before written history began. By the end of our journey, you will see the ancient roots of our modern, interconnected world in a completely new light. How did a piece of volcanic glass from Turkey end up in a village hundreds of miles away? What does a seashell from the coast reveal about a community deep in the African interior? We will piece together clues from archaeology and science to uncover these lost pathways of exchange. They were more than just routes for moving goods. They were the first internet, carrying ideas, technologies, and beliefs between distant cultures. This story challenges everything we think we know about isolated ancient societies. What does it mean to discover that our ancestors were global citizens long before the word global ever existed? A single obsidian blade, sharp enough to slice through hide, is placed into the waiting hands of a trader from a distant valley. In return, he offers a string of polished seashells, gleaming white and carried from a shore his trading partner has never seen. This was not a simple store transaction. It was a profound human moment, a ritual of connection that wove separate worlds together. Archaeologist Colin Renfrew described this Neolithic system of exchange as the internet of its day, a network pulsating with information. With every tool, ornament, or bag of grain that changed hands, so too did knowledge. A new way to knap stone, a story about a spirit, a recipe for a stronger pot, all hitched a ride along these routes. These exchanges were the lifeblood of community survival and specialization. At a site like Çatalhöyük, a vast Neolithic settlement in Turkey, we find tools made from obsidian that came from volcanoes hundreds of miles away. This was not a random find. It points to a deliberate, sustained connection. Someone knew where to get the best stone. Someone else knew how to travel the path to bring it back. The goods that moved were both brutally practical and deeply symbolic. There were heavy basalt stones for grinding grain and sturdy flint for making fire. And then there were delicate beads of ostrich eggshell, vibrant pigments of red ochre, and shimmering seashells that held no practical function other than to be beautiful, to signify status, or perhaps to be used in a ceremonial practice. This trade operated on a currency far more ancient than coinage. It ran on trust, on reciprocity, and on shared cultural understandings that allowed a stranger to be welcomed. So how did these initial, face-to-face barters evolve into the invisible highways that would one day span thousands of miles, connecting continents long before the first cities were ever dreamed of? That volcanic glass blade, crafted with such care in Anatolia, began a journey its maker could scarcely comprehend. It traveled hundreds of miles, passed from hand to hand, until it was finally unearthed by archaeologists at the ancient site of Jericho. This was not an isolated find. The pre-pottery Neolithic layers of Jericho are filled with obsidian that chemically matches specific volcanoes in Turkey and Armenia. We know this with certainty because of a scientific technique called isotopic analysis. Think of it as a material's unique fingerprint. Every volcanic source has a distinct geochemical signature, and by testing an artifact, scientists can pinpoint the exact mountain it was born from. The results are consistently astonishing, revealing trade routes that spanned vast and challenging landscapes. Why would communities go to such extraordinary lengths for a specific type of stone? Researcher Stephen Mithen suggests obsidian was far more than a simple commodity. In a world where the finest cutting tool was a sharp flake of stone, obsidian was the ultimate technology. It could be napped to an edge far sharper than any metal scalpel, a prized possession for any hunter or artisan. Possessing it was a sign of status and connection to a wider, more sophisticated world. This demand sparked what we might call the first entrepreneurship. Individuals or family groups likely specialized in the dangerous work of traveling to the source, perhaps even controlling the knowledge of its location, to bring back this invaluable resource. The logistics of these obsidian roads were a marvel of ancient ingenuity. Traders did not simply wander. They followed the lay of the land, using river valleys as natural corridors and seeking out mountain passes that offered the path of least resistance. They carried this precious cargo in manageable loads, likely trading it at intermediary settlements, which acted like prehistoric trading posts. Each handoff extended the network's reach. The presence of Anatolian obsidian in Jericho tells a profound story. It reveals that even at this incredibly early date, societies valued specific resources enough to establish and maintain cross-regional connections that overcame immense geographical and cultural barriers. What does this movement of a single, specific material tell us about their priorities? It shows that innovation, efficiency, and even social standing were driving forces as powerful then as they are today. The flow of obsidian mapped an economy of both practical need and social aspiration, a sophisticated system that moved more than just goods, it moved culture itself. And if something as solid as stone could travel such distances, what about materials that were lighter, brighter, and even more visually captivating? A child's simple seashell necklace on a Red Sea beach held a future that stretched across an entire continent. These small, glossy cowrie shells, once strung together, would one day travel thousands of miles inland, becoming a form of currency and a powerful symbol of connection. This was the second great network, an exchange built not on practical tools but on beauty and social meaning. Anthropologists like Ian Hodder have studied how such ornaments, often found in ancient resting places, were far more than decoration. They were a language of identity, signaling who you were, where you belonged, and the breadth of your social network. To create these tiny treasures was a feat of patience and skill. Each bead, whether made from shell, bone, or ostrich eggshell, had to be carefully shaped, then painstakingly drilled with a sharp stone point, polished for hours on a rough surface, and finally strung. This was not mass production. Each piece carried the mark of its maker. The journey of these beads was just as remarkable. Starting from a coastal village, a strand might be traded to a community a few days inland. There, it might be combined with other local goods and traded again, moving slowly from hand to hand, village to village, in a relay of value that could last generations. We find stunning proof of this in Paleolithic caves in Morocco, where nacreous shells from the distant Mediterranean Sea have been discovered. These shells, with their small, perforated tops, were clearly carried across a vast body of water, suggesting a trans-Mediterranean connection that existed tens of thousands of years ago. Even more compelling is the Omo River Valley in Ethiopia, where archaeologists have uncovered shell beads from the coast that date back an incredible 40,000 years. This evidence pushes the origins of long-distance trade into a much deeper past than we ever imagined. Why would humans attribute such profound value to these seemingly mundane objects? A simple shell has no practical use for a hunter in the interior. Its power was entirely symbolic. It represented a connection to a distant, almost mythical world, the ocean. It could signify wealth, social standing, or perhaps be used in a ceremonial practice. This drive to possess meaning, to adorn ourselves with stories from far away, was a powerful engine that fueled the creation of trade routes spanning impossible distances. It reminds us that ancient exchange was about more than survival. It was about constructing identity and understanding one's place in a wider universe. This innate desire for meaning naturally drew our ancestors toward materials that shimmered with something even more potent, a sense of the sacred. The warm golden glow of amber must have seemed like captured sunlight to ancient eyes. This fossilized tree resin, washed up on the shores of the Baltic Sea, became one of history's most alluring luxury items, sparking a trade network that connected the frigid north with the brilliant civilizations of the Mediterranean. Historian Anthony Harding describes amber as a supernatural substance, believed to hold protective and even magical properties. This was not merely a beautiful trinket, it was a piece of the otherworld, a talisman that motivated traders to undertake journeys of incredible danger and length. The primary pathway became known as the Amber Road, a series of river valleys and overland trails that snaked southward. Traders likely followed great rivers like the Vistula and the Danube, using these natural highways to move their precious cargo from the Baltic coast through the heart of Europe and down into the sun-drenched lands of Greece and beyond. This route was not a single road but a web of connections, facilitating contact between vastly different cultures who might never have met otherwise. The evidence for this network's reach is staggering. Archaeologists have uncovered beads and carvings of distinct Baltic amber in the royal shaft graves of Mycenaean Greece, and even more remarkably within the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs. These finds prove that for over a millennium, this golden substance was being systematically traded across the entire European continent. A fascinating case study lies in Germany's Tollens Valley, a site known for a major conflict from the Bronze Age. Here, among other finds, pieces of amber have been discovered, suggesting this was more than a battlefield. It was a known crossroads, a hub where north-south trade routes converged and on at least one fateful occasion clashed. The existence of the Amber Road forces us to reconsider the motivations behind ancient exploration. It was not only practical needs that drove people to map the unknown, but also an insatiable desire for rarity, for beauty, and for items that connected them to the divine. This powerful allure for precious materials capable of bridging entire continents was not unique to the golden forests of the north. A similar fascination, centered on a stone of deep, cool green, was simultaneously weaving its own web of connection across the vast expanse of Asia. While the golden glow of amber traveled south, a stone of deep, cool green was simultaneously moving east and west, carving its own pathways through the heart of Asia. In the hands of a master carver in ancient China, a block of nephrite jade was transformed into a ceremonial blade, its surface polished to a liquid sheen. This was not mere stone, it was a substance believed to contain the essence of heaven and earth, a key to immortality, and the ultimate symbol of legitimate authority. Archaeologist Jessica Rawson described these jade objects as vehicles of cosmological ideas, their forms and symbols spreading along the very trade routes that carried the physical material. This created what scholars call jade circles, vast cultural spheres unified by a shared reverence for this sacred stone, connecting distinct societies like the Hongshan in the northeast and the Liangzhu in the south. The geological source for much of this prized nephrite lay thousands of kilometers away in the remote Kunlun Mountains of Central Asia. Transporting heavy, raw boulders of jade across such immense distances was a monumental task. Traders likely used a combination of river networks, floating rafts down treacherous waters, and arduous overland trails through mountain passes and deserts, a logistical feat that speaks to the material's profound value. The reach of this network is stunningly illustrated by discoveries at sites like Shimao in China, a massive stone-built settlement dating to around 2,000 years before the Common Era. Here, archaeologists found jade artifacts whose chemical signature points directly to the distant Kunlun sources, proving a vast, organized trade was operating at a staggering scale. Even more remarkably, Liangzhu-style jade artifacts have been found at sites in Vietnam, suggesting that these cosmological ideas were not just moving overland, but were also carried across the sea by maritime traders. How did the trade in a spiritually significant material like jade actually foster shared beliefs and practices across such a wide area? As the stone moved, so did the artisans and the knowledge of how to work it. Specific carving techniques, the meanings behind ritual shapes like the Bai disc and the Kong tube, and the very association of jade with power and the divine, all traveled together. A leader in one region could legitimize their rule by possessing jades that echoed the symbols of a powerful, distant culture. This was a deep cultural exchange where trade moved far beyond objects and into the realm of shared worldviews. This silent, continent-spanning conversation in stone demonstrates how trade networks were the original conduits for unifying ideas, but they were equally vital for something much more tangible: the explosive spread of technology that would reshape the ancient world. The knowledge of bronze making was a treasure more valuable than any single artifact. A traveling smith, carrying not just goods but the secrets of his craft, could arrive in a village that knew only stone and copper. Within a generation, that community's entire way of life, from how they farmed to how they defended themselves, could be transformed. This was the true power of the forgotten trade networks. They were the original World Wide Web for technological data, transmitting revolutionary ideas across continents. Historian Jared Diamond famously argued that this diffusion of innovation through contact and exchange was often a greater driver of progress than independent invention. It was simply faster and more efficient for a society to adopt a proven technology from a neighbor than to rediscover it from scratch. The movement of metallurgy is a perfect example. The intricate process of smelting copper, which first emerged in the Balkans around 7,000 years ago, did not stay there. It traveled along established trade routes, moving slowly into Western Europe as knowledge was shared between communities. The same pattern appears with the wheel. Initially developed for pottery in Mesopotamia, the concept was adapted for carts and chariots, its design spreading eastward all the way to the Indus Valley civilization. But how did this complex knowledge actually transfer from one culture to another? The most direct method was through migrant artisans. A skilled metalworker, perhaps enticed by a local chieftain's offer of status or wealth, would relocate, bringing his irreplaceable expertise with him. Intermarriage between communities also served as a vital channel, weaving technical knowledge into the fabric of family lineages, and sometimes the technology was embedded in the goods themselves. A finely crafted bronze dagger from a distant land was not just a weapon, it was a puzzle. Local smiths would acquire such an item and through careful study, reverse engineer the methods used to create it, unlocking the secrets of alloying copper with tin. A compelling case study exists in Central Asia, in the region known as the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex. Here, around 4,000 years ago, advanced metalworking techniques and sophisticated pottery styles appear quite suddenly in the archaeological record. They bear a striking resemblance to technologies from both Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, suggesting this area was a crucial melting pot, a hub where trade routes converged and knowledge was freely exchanged and adapted. It is a profound question to consider: how different would our modern world be if these early networks had not existed? If the wheel or bronze or writing had been confined to their place of origin, the pace of human history would have been dramatically slower. The free flow of technology across boundaries, a process we see as modern, was in fact the ancient norm. And just as these routes carried the blueprints for new tools, they also carried the very seeds of life itself, introducing new plants and animals that would reshape entire landscapes and diets. A single seed, carefully selected from a hardy stalk of wheat in the Fertile Crescent, held the potential to reshape entire continents. This was the most vital cargo moving along the forgotten trade routes, the living, breathing exchange of domesticated plants. Botanists like Daniel Zohary have used genetic analysis to trace the incredible journeys of crops like barley and lentils, mapping their spread from isolated centers of origin to become staples across the ancient world. These were the grain corridors, the biological superhighways that quietly revolutionized human life. At the site of Mayagar in Pakistan, dating back over 9,000 years, archaeologists have uncovered the preserved remains of wheat and barley. The genetic story of these grains points directly to the Near East, proving that the knowledge of farming and the seeds themselves traveled vast distances, likely carried by generations of migrating farmers and traders. This was not a simple transfer of goods, it was the transfer of an entire way of life. The process required immense trust and the building of long-term relationships between communities. A farmer would not risk their family's survival on unknown seeds from a stranger. These exchanges were built on repeated contact, on the shared understanding that a successful harvest for one's trading partners meant future security for everyone. This network of trust is beautifully illustrated by the Bantu expansion across Africa. As Bantu-speaking communities moved, they did not travel into empty lands. They interacted with existing populations, and through these encounters, they exchanged vital crops. Sorghum from the Sahel and yams from the forests were integrated into their agricultural practices, allowing them to adapt to and thrive in incredibly diverse new environments. The movement of a single plant species could fundamentally alter a landscape and a culture. Consider the journey of millet from northern China to the Indian subcontinent. This hardy, fast-growing grain was perfectly suited to drier conditions. Its adoption in India allowed farming to expand into new ecological zones, supporting population growth and leading to the development of unique culinary traditions that persist to this day. How did the introduction of a new staple crop reshape the identity of a people? It changed their daily diet, their seasonal rituals, and their connection to the land itself. The biological legacy of these ancient seed exchanges is all around us, on our dinner plates and in our fields, a quiet testament to the profound impact of trade on human adaptation. And just as seeds traveled, so too did the animals that would pull our plows and carry our goods, completing the agricultural revolution that these networks made possible. The first domesticated horses introduced to Mesopotamia must have seemed like creatures of legend. These powerful animals, originally from the Eurasian steppes, did not just change how people moved, they revolutionized warfare, agriculture, and the very scale of what was possible. This movement of animals represents a sixth, deeply influential network, the exchange of living, breathing capital. Zooarchaeologists like Melinda Zeder analyze ancient animal bones, and their findings reveal intricate patterns of trade and domestication that span the globe. Animals were far more than simple sources of food or labor. A prized bull could be a symbol of a chieftain's wealth, a flock of sheep a family's entire security, and a pure white lamb a vital religious offering. These powerful social and spiritual motivations drove the demand that pulled species across continents. Consider the humble donkey, first domesticated in Northeast Africa. Its remarkable endurance and ability to thrive on little water made it the engine of overland trade in arid regions. Caravans of donkeys could carry goods across the Sinai Peninsula, connecting the civilizations of Egypt and the Levant. Meanwhile, across the oceans, chickens were embarking on their own long journey. Originating in the jungles of Southeast Asia, these birds spread westward, not over land, but through sophisticated maritime networks. They traveled on the boats of early Austronesian seafarers, reaching distant islands and eventually the coasts of Africa and Europe, not just as food, but often as creatures of ceremonial significance. One of the most transformative animal exchanges was the introduction of the camel to the Sahara. This single event, likely occurring in the early first millennium before the Common Era, turned the world's greatest desert from an impassable barrier into a bridge. The camel's ability to travel for days without water enabled the creation of the Trans-Saharan trade routes, which would later carry gold, salt, and ideas between West Africa and the Mediterranean world. Similarly, on the precursor routes to what would become the Silk Road, a vibrant exchange was already flourishing. Powerful horses from the Central Asian steppes were highly sought after by the settled empires of China, who traded luxurious rolls of silk for these living engines of military might. The movement of these animals did more than just facilitate trade. It fundamentally rewrote the rules of human society. The arrival of a new species could alter local ecosystems, introduce new diseases, and reshape entire economies. The ability to own and breed large livestock created new social hierarchies, separating the wealthy pastoralist from the subsistence farmer. How different would our world look if the horse had never left the steppes, or if the camel had never crossed the Sahara? This dynamic exchange of life highlights the incredible mobility of the ancient world, a mobility that was not confined to land. The same innovative spirit that drove caravans across deserts was also pushing people to build vessels capable of crossing the vast, empty expanses of the open sea. The vast Pacific Ocean was not an empty expanse but a web of known pathways. An outrigger canoe, its sail catching the wind, carried more than just obsidian tools and domesticated chickens. It carried the very knowledge of the ocean itself. This was the seventh network, the maritime highways that connected islands and continents across the world's greatest waters. These seafarers navigated using a deep, learned intimacy with their environment. They read the subtle patterns of swells, followed the flight paths of migratory birds, and memorized the precise positions of stars, a skill historian David Lewis called wayfinding. This traditional science allowed for voyages of thousands of miles across open sea, all without a single modern instrument. The motivation for these incredible journeys was a powerful expansion, often called the Austronesian dispersal. Starting from the island of Taiwan, these people spread south and east, carrying a complete cultural package in their boats. They brought their languages, their agricultural practices like taro and yam cultivation, and a distinct style of pottery known as lapita. The spread of this pottery from Papua New Guinea across to the distant islands of Samoa and Tonga maps the extent of their trade and settlement network like a trail of breadcrumbs across the ocean. This was not a random migration, it was a deliberate, sustained effort to connect and colonize. Meanwhile, in the Indian Ocean, another sophisticated trade system was flourishing. At sites in Oman, archaeologists have uncovered fragments of pottery that are chemically identical to wares from the ancient Indus Valley civilization, dating back to around 2,000 years before the Common Era. This proves that ships were plying the routes between Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and the Arabian Peninsula, creating a vibrant economic circuit. The goods that moved on these maritime routes were legendary. There were fragrant spices like cloves and nutmeg from the Moluccas, lustrous pearls from the Persian Gulf, and the deep blue lapis lazuli from the mines of Afghanistan, which we find set into the gold masks of Egyptian pharaohs. These voyages required more than just navigational skill. They depended on complex social structures. Trader diplomats acted as cultural ambassadors, living for extended periods in foreign ports to learn local languages and customs, fostering the trust necessary for these long-distance relationships to thrive. What does this mastery of the sea tell us about the human spirit? It speaks to a breathtaking courage and an insatiable desire to reach beyond the known horizon. This was connection forged not along easy river valleys, but across the terrifying and magnificent open ocean. Yet, while these maritime networks connected the world by water, an equally formidable challenge was being overcome on land, where traders faced the immense, silent barriers of the world's highest mountains and most arid deserts. The open grasslands of the Eurasian steppe were a superhighway in constant motion. While cities rose and fell on the edges of this vast sea of grass, nomadic herders were its true masters, driving their wagons and livestock across horizons, weaving together the fates of distant civilizations from the Yellow River to the Danube. This was the eighth network, the Trans-Eurasian steppe corridors, a system of mobility that thrived for millennia before the Silk Road was ever named. Researchers like Barry Cunliffe describe these pastoralists as the essential intermediaries, the living links between the settled worlds of China, Persia, and Europe. The geography itself dictated this role. Unlike dense forests or impassable mountains, the steppe was an open, traversable landscape, a natural highway that invited movement on a continental scale. The Yamnaya culture, emerging from the Pontic-Caspian steppe around 5,000 years ago, were among the first to master this environment. Their innovation was not just herding, but a revolutionary package of mobility, including the wheeled wagon and later horseback riding. This mastery allowed them to cover immense distances, and as they moved, they carried more than just their belongings. They carried new technologies like advanced metallurgy for crafting bronze weapons and tools, and they carried their languages. Many scholars suggest the incredible spread of Indo-European languages, from Sanskrit in India to Latin in Europe, finds its roots in these early, expansive movements across the steppe. The goods that traveled these routes speak of a deeply interconnected world. Archaeologists have found fragments of Chinese silk in Celtic burial mounds in Germany, and delicate glass beads from the Mediterranean in the frozen tombs or kurgans of Siberian chieftains. A stunning case study comes from the Prehistoric burials in the Altai Mountains. In these tombs, preserved by permafrost, we find a nomadic chieftain buried with an astonishing collection of goods that map his connections. There are intricate felt textiles and woven carpets displaying artistic styles from Persia. There are bronze mirrors from China and elaborate horse trappings decorated in a distinct local animal style. This was not the hoard of an isolated tribesman, but of a well-connected elite whose wealth and identity were built upon his place in a global network. How was this nomadic lifestyle so perfectly suited to linking disparate worlds? Their entire existence was built around mobility and seasonal migration. This constant movement meant they naturally encountered different groups, learning their customs and needs. They were not tied to one piece of land, so their allegiance was to the network itself, to the pathways and the relationships that made their way of life possible. Their economy was based on herd animals, which provided a mobile, living resource that could be traded for the luxuries and necessities produced by settled farmers and city dwellers. They became the indispensable middlemen, the couriers of an entire continent. The success of the steppe corridors demonstrates that the most effective trade networks are not always built on fixed roads, but on fluid patterns of movement and deep cultural adaptability. This mastery over horizontal plains, however, would soon be tested by the most vertical and unforgiving landscapes on Earth. A caravan moves as a single dark line against an endless sea of sand, each camel laden with gleaming white blocks of salt. This was the ultimate test of the trade networks, the desert trails that forged connections across the most hostile environments on Earth. Historian E.W. Boville chronicled the legendary gold-salt trade that powered West African empires like Ghana and Mali, where salt was literally worth its weight in gold. But this system began long before the camel defined the Sahara. In an earlier, wetter era, the desert was a land of lakes and grasslands. Rock art from the Yuana cave in Libya vividly depicts cattle herders, suggesting that the first desert trade relied on donkeys and oxen, moving along routes defined by seasonal water sources. The adoption of the camel around 500 years before the Common Era changed everything. With their ability to travel for weeks without water, these ships of the desert turned an impassable barrier into a bridge, enabling the regular, large-scale caravans we imagine today. The evidence for this vast exchange is buried in the sands. Roman coins have been discovered in West African archaeological sites, while fine African ivory was prized in Middle Eastern markets, proving a two-way flow of goods that spanned the continent. But these routes carried more than just commodities. They were conduits for faith and ideas. The spread of Islam into West Africa was not achieved by conquest, but followed the peaceful paths of merchants and scholars. Oasis towns like Sijil Massa and Timbuktu blossomed from simple watering holes into thriving centers of commerce and learning, their libraries and universities standing as testament to the knowledge that traveled with the trade goods. How did these traders overcome the sheer scale and deadliness of the desert? Their success was a masterpiece of logistics and inherited wisdom. They navigated by the stars and by the subtle shapes of dunes, their routes carefully planned from one known well to the next. They formed deep alliances with nomadic Tuareg and Berber groups who knew the desert's secrets, building a chain of trust that stretched for thousands of miles. The resilience required for these crossings stands as a powerful reminder that trade networks were, above all, feats of human adaptation. They moved not only gold and salt across the dunes, but the very blueprint for survival in an extreme world. This mastery of the tangible world of goods and geography inevitably raised a deeper question. What about the invisible cargo of ideas, beliefs, and stories that traveled silently with every caravan? A storyteller's voice rises and falls with the firelight, blending the serpentine water spirit of the Euphrates with the celestial dragon of the Yellow River. This was the most precious and invisible cargo moving along the ancient trade routes, the exchange of ideas, beliefs, and entire worldviews. Anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss argued that trade was never just about objects, it was a profound form of communication. Every shell, every bead, every blade was a message wrapped in cultural meaning, a letter from one way of life to another. The movement of these ideas could reshape civilizations. Consider the powerful concept of an afterlife, a journey to a world beyond our own. Archaeological evidence suggests that this belief, which first appeared in elaborate forms in the ancient Near East, traveled along trade routes into Europe. We see it in the changing burial practices, where simple resting places gradually transform into monumental tombs filled with goods for the next life, a spiritual idea carried on the backs of donkeys and in the minds of merchants. Artistic motifs were particularly contagious. The dragon, that iconic serpentine beast, began its life in the mythologies of ancient China as a benevolent river deity and a symbol of imperial power. Over centuries, the concept traveled west along the steppe corridors, morphing as it moved. It was adopted and adapted by cultures in Persia and Central Asia, eventually reaching medieval Europe, where it took on its familiar role as a fearsome, treasure-hoarding creature. This was not mere copying, it was a creative conversation spanning thousands of miles and years. Another shared story that echoes across continents is the Great Flood myth. Variations of this cataclysmic event appear in the Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia, in the Book of Genesis, and in Hindu scriptures. While these certainly speak to a common human experience of devastating natural forces, their specific narrative parallels suggest they too may have been seeds of story carried along trade routes, told and retold at countless campfires from one end of the known world to the other. Perhaps the most revolutionary idea to travel was writing itself. The Phoenicians, master traders of the Mediterranean, developed a simple, accessible alphabet to manage their commercial records. As they established ports from Lebanon to Spain, they brought this system with them. The Greeks encountered it, recognized its utility, and adapted it for their own language, adding vowels and creating the script that would become the foundation of Western literature. This was a technology transfer of incalculable importance, all fueled by commerce. A stunning physical example of this cultural blending comes from the Oxus civilization, a society that thrived in Central Asia around 4,000 years ago. Here, in artifacts from this trading hub, we see a remarkable fusion. Seals bear the distinct artistic style of the distant Indus Valley, while ceremonial vessels show clear influences from Mesopotamia. This was a melting pot where symbols and beliefs met and merged, creating a unique cultural identity built entirely on connection. Could this constant, low-level exchange of stories and gods have actually made the ancient world more peaceful? While conflict certainly existed, sharing a common mythological framework or recognizing a similar symbol of power may have provided a foundation for understanding. It fostered a nascent sense of a wider human community, where a stranger was not always an enemy, but a potential bearer of a fascinating new story. This deep cultural glue held the networks together, but it was the practical, everyday rules of human interaction that gave them the strength to endure for millennia. A finely carved ceremonial axe passes from one leader's hands to another, an act that binds two communities together for generations. This was the ritual exchange system, a network built not on price but on priceless social value. These were economies of honor, where the most important commodity was the relationship itself. The French sociologist Marcel Mauss studied this phenomenon, calling the gift a total social fact. He observed that in many cultures, a present was never truly free. It carried with it an invisible weight, the spirit of the giver, creating a powerful obligation for a future return. This cycle of giving and receiving wove the entire economic system directly into the fabric of culture, religion, and family ties. One of the most famous examples is the Kula Ring of the Pacific. In this vast archipelago, chiefs and traders undertook dangerous ocean voyages in outrigger canoes. Their goal was not profit but prestige, exchanged through two specific types of shell valuables. White shell bracelets called emwali traveled clockwise around the island circle, while red shell necklaces, known as solava, moved counterclockwise. A man gained his status not by hoarding these treasures, but by keeping them in motion, passing them on to his partners in a different island. These shell valuables were rarely worn. Their power was in their history, in the famous names of the previous owners they carried with them on their endless journey. This system created a web of peaceful interdependence across hundreds of miles of ocean, ensuring safe passage and mutual aid between communities that might otherwise have been rivals. Archaeological evidence from sites in Papua New Guinea confirms that these kinds of exchanges, focused on obsidian and shell, have been operating for at least 2,000 years. A similar principle fueled the potlatch ceremonies of the northwest coast of North America. Here, a chief would demonstrate his wealth and status by giving it all away in a great feast. He would distribute vast quantities of blankets, finely crafted copper shields, and food to his guests. The more he gave, the greater his social standing became. This was a powerful way to resolve conflicts, cement alliances, and redistribute wealth within the community, all without a single coin ever changing hands. Far to the east, the Hopewell interaction sphere created a continent-wide network for ritual exchange. From the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, communities traded extraordinary materials over vast distances. There was obsidian from Wyoming, mica from the Appalachians, and shark teeth from the Atlantic coast. These were not used for everyday tools. They were crafted into elaborate ceremonial objects like animal effigy pipes and intricate ear spools, which were then placed in burial mounds. The value of these items lay entirely in their exotic origin and their spiritual significance, uniting a diverse range of cultures in a shared cosmological understanding. How might our modern, impersonal markets change if we reintroduced this concept of reciprocal obligation? The ritual exchange systems teach us that the strongest economies are often those built on trust and honor, where a handshake carries more weight than a contract. These social networks required a physical backbone to function, a landscape of paths, way stations, and ports that made the movement of both gifts and goods possible. A seasonal fair at a river confluence was a spectacle of human connection. Under temporary awnings, a trader from the northern hills would offer fine furs, while another from the southern plains displayed colorful feathers, their languages mingling in a vibrant hum of commerce and conversation. These were the nodes of the ancient network, the physical and social infrastructure that gave the invisible web its enduring strength. Geographer James Blount noted that trade routes are not arbitrary. They are the paths of least resistance, shaped by the land itself. A river was not just a source of water, it was a ready-made highway that flowed in both directions. A mountain pass, though challenging, was infinitely preferable to scaling a sheer cliff face. A coastal inlet offered safe harbor from the open sea's fury. These natural features became the world's first signposts, guiding travelers to inevitable meeting points. A shallow river ford was one such magnet. To cross, everyone had to converge at the same spot. This simple geographic fact made these places natural for exchange. What began as a temporary camp for weary travelers could, over generations, evolve into a permanent trading post and then a thriving town. Its very location was its reason for being, born from the logic of movement and connection. The Indus Valley civilization mastered this principle. Their great cities, like Lothal, featured sophisticated, brick-lined dockyards connected by channels to the sea. This was not a spontaneous development. It was deliberate, engineered infrastructure designed to welcome the world's ships. Similarly, in the vast deserts, the caravanserai emerged as an oasis of safety. These fortified guesthouses were spaced a day's journey apart, offering shelter, water, and a secure place for merchants and their precious caravans to rest. They formed a chain of hospitality stretching across thousands of miles, a man-made lifeline in a hostile land. But how did trade flourish between groups who might otherwise view each other with suspicion? The answer often lay in neutral or sacred ground, a site considered holy by multiple cultures, or a traditional meeting place at a territorial border could host trade under a temporary truce. The goods themselves were a language of peace, their value a shared interest that transcended conflict. The Amber Road provides a fascinating case study. Along its length, ancient burial mounds were often erected on high ground. For the traveler, these mounds served as visible landmarks, guiding the way across a trackless landscape. But they were also powerful territorial markers, signifying a community's presence and their claim to the route. They were constant reminders that the path was not empty, but belonged to a people, blending the practical with the profoundly spiritual. How did the design of these trade infrastructures influence the growth of cities and states? The answer is deeply. A successful port or market generated wealth, attracting artisans, farmers, and leaders. It required administration to manage disputes, standardize weights, and provide security. This concentration of people, resources, and power was the very crucible in which the first cities were forged. The physical remnants of these networks, from a worn stone wharf to the foundation of a desert fort, speak of an ancestral ingenuity that understood the mechanics of connection on a grand scale. This mastery of geography and social trust naturally demanded another kind of innovation, the tools that could measure value and guide a journey through the trackless wild. A merchant's hand, calloused and sure, measures a length of linen against the stretch of his own forearm. This simple act, repeated countless times across the ancient world, was a foundational technology of trade. Before rulers and written receipts, the human body itself provided the first units of measurement, a universal language of length and volume built on the span of a hand, the length of a foot, or the distance a man could plow in a day. Historian Lionel Casson, in his studies of ancient seafaring, revealed how these practical systems were paralleled by equally ingenious methods of navigation. On the open ocean, without a single compass, sailors became intimate readers of the natural world. They memorized the precise rising and setting points of key stars, watched for the specific flight patterns of land-nesting birds returning at dusk, and learned to feel the subtle deflection of ocean swells as they bounced off distant, unseen islands. This was a science of observation passed down through generations in song and story. How could a trader guarantee a fair deal with someone who spoke a different tongue, or ensure a promised delivery would be honored months later? The earliest contracts were not written but embodied. In prehistoric Europe, notched tally sticks made of bone or wood served as a physical record of a debt or an agreement. Each cut represented a quantity owed, and the stick would be split lengthwise, with each party keeping one half. The only way to verify the deal was to perfectly match the two pieces together, a simple yet fraud-resistant system that built the trust necessary for commerce to flourish. This concept of tangible agreement extended to the sophisticated token system of the ancient Near East. Before the first word was ever written on clay, merchants used small, geometrically shaped clay tokens, each representing a specific type and quantity of goods, like a jar of oil or a measure of grain. These tokens were sealed inside a hollow clay ball, or bulla, which acted as a bill of lading, its surface impressions mirroring the tokens within. To confirm a shipment, one would simply break the ball and count the contents. It was a three-dimensional prototype of an invoice, a brilliant innovation that managed complex transactions without a single written word. Perhaps the most elegant example of this intuitive technology comes from the Polynesian navigators and their stick charts. These were not maps of land, but dynamic diagrams of the sea itself. Carefully arranged sticks and shells represented the patterns of ocean currents and the swells created by distant islands, which an experienced navigator could feel through the hull of his canoe. They were a portable, tactile memory system for navigating a featureless expanse of water, reducing the terrifying uncertainty of the open ocean to a known and manageable path. On land, standard weights provided another layer of confidence. The Indus Valley civilization produced meticulously shaped stone cubes in precise, repeating units, ensuring that a measure of grain or a weight of lapis lazuli meant the same thing in the great city of Mohenjo-Daro as it did in a distant port. This move toward standardization was a quiet revolution, a collective agreement that fostered fairness and enabled trade to scale beyond face-to-face barter. Each of these tools, from the knotted cord to the balanced scale, was an answer to a fundamental human need to reduce risk and build confidence across time and distance. They were the practical mechanics that turned a hopeful exchange into a reliable system, proving that the real infrastructure of these vast networks was not just made of paths and ports, but of shared ingenuity and mutual understanding. This legacy of innovation left behind a silent question for future generations to answer. How could we ever hope to see the full scope of a network that left no written records behind? A tiny pottery shard, seemingly worthless, holds within its clay a hidden passport to its place of origin. This is the silent testimony that archaeologists used to map a world without maps, reconstructing forgotten trade routes one scientific analysis at a time. The pioneering work of scholars like Colin Renfrew demonstrated that we could trace the journey of materials like obsidian by identifying their unique geochemical fingerprint, a technique now applied to a vast array of artifacts. Using methods like X-ray fluorescence, scientists can bombard a piece of bronze or pottery with energy, causing it to emit a signature of light that reveals the exact elemental composition of its source material. This tells us not just what an object is, but where it was born. Strontium isotope analysis goes even further, reading the geological story locked into tooth enamel or bone. As people and animals consume food and water from a specific region, they incorporate a local isotopic signature into their bodies. By analyzing the remains of a person or a traded animal found far from home, researchers can pinpoint the landscape of their childhood, revealing profound stories of individual mobility. Perhaps the most intimate glimpse into ancient commerce comes from residue analysis. A seemingly empty ceramic pot, when examined at a molecular level, often retains traces of the substances it once held. Through lipid analysis, scientists can identify the faint chemical ghosts of ancient wines, olive oils, or dairy products that were traded across vast distances. These invisible clues transform a simple container into a cargo manifest. But how do we move from 1,000 individual data points to a coherent map of an entire network? This is where computational modeling and spatial analysis come into play. Researchers feed all this provenance data into sophisticated software, which can then calculate the most probable paths between a source and a find site, factoring in terrain, river systems, and the known locations of ancient settlements. These models help us see the patterns in the noise, revealing the superhighways and backroads of the ancient economy. The process is not without its significant challenges. The archaeological record is famously fragmentary, a collection of random survivals. For every shipwreck we find, 1,000 have dissolved into the sea. A more difficult puzzle is the problem of indirect trade. An object found in Egypt may have originated in Anatolia, but it could have passed through a dozen hands in between, making the true route a complex chain rather than a simple line. A perfect case study that brings all these methods together is the Uluburan shipwreck, a vessel that sank off the coast of Turkey over 3,000 years ago. Its preserved cargo was a microcosm of the late Bronze Age world. There were copper ingots from Cyprus, ebony and ivory from Africa, tin from Central Asia, amber from the Baltic, and cannonite jars filled with terebinth resin. By analyzing this single collection of goods, researchers could vividly reconstruct a trading mission that connected the Mycenaean Greeks, the Cypriots, and the powerful kingdoms of the Levant in a single, thriving circuit. It makes you wonder, with scientific tools growing more powerful every year, what intricate connections remain invisible to us now that future technologies will one day bring to light. This entire scientific endeavor is a deeply interdisciplinary pursuit, blending geology, chemistry, and computer science with the traditional trowel work of archaeology. Yet for all these technical marvels, they ultimately point us back to the human element, to the individual merchants and sailors whose lives were spent navigating these routes, and whose personal stories are the final, compelling piece of this ancient puzzle. A single carnelian bead, polished to a deep red gleam, is carefully packed for a journey its maker will not take. Instead, a woman from the Indus Valley shoulders the load, her path set toward the bustling cities of Mesopotamia. She is more than a merchant, she is a living bridge, carrying not just goods but the very essence of her culture to a foreign land. Who were these individuals who undertook such epic journeys, binding the ancient world together with their footsteps? They were not a single class of professional merchants as we imagine today, but a tapestry of people fulfilling many roles. Some were seasonal travelers, farmers who used the quiet months after harvest to trade their community's surplus grain for rare stones or tools. Others were nomadic pastoralists whose constant movement between seasonal grazing grounds made them perfect intermediaries, carrying news and goods from one settled village to another. Their social role was often cemented by ritual. Among the Kung San people of southern Africa, anthropologists have documented the H-Zaro system, a gift exchange that builds lifelong partnerships between individuals. A gift given creates an obligation for a return gift, but not immediately. This cycle of reciprocal giving weaves a web of social security and friendship that can be called upon in times of need. This ancient practice offers a powerful analogy for how early trade might have functioned, less as cold commerce and more as the building of sacred social bonds. The archaeological record offers haunting glimpses into these individuals' lives. In some burials from the Bronze Age, we find people interred with very specific grave goods, small, finely carved stone weights and scales alongside exotic items from distant lands. These are not the weapons of a warrior or the tools of a farmer, but the signature kit of a trader, suggesting it was a respected and distinct identity, even in death. The role of women in these networks may have been far more central than traditionally assumed. From the Neolithic era, we find stout female figurines, their forms exaggerated, often interpreted as symbols of fertility. But could some of these figures represent something else entirely? Perhaps trader deities who protected those on the move, or even commemorate the actual women who managed the exchange of vital resources within and between communities. The famous statues from Ain Ghazel in Jordan, with their striking, shell-bit eyes, might depict ritual specialists whose authority helped facilitate trade, using their spiritual standing to guarantee safe passage and fair dealing between groups. This personalization of trade forces us to ask a deeper question. How did this role transform over the centuries? It likely began with a community representative, someone trading on behalf of their entire village, their success meaning collective survival. Over time, as connections grew more complex, we see the emergence of the independent entrepreneur, the individual who built their own wealth and identity on their ability to navigate between worlds. Understanding the people behind the pottery shards and stone weights changes everything. It transforms these vast, impersonal networks into a story of human courage, trust, and ingenuity. What kind of person looks at a distant mountain range or a vast desert and sees not a barrier but a path to a new connection? They were the original global citizens, and their legacy is the interconnected world we inhabit today. That trader, standing at the foot of a treacherous mountain pass, faced the ultimate calculation of risk versus reward. The ancient economy was a high-stakes venture, where a single successful journey could elevate an entire family's status for generations, while one misstep could mean the loss of everything. Economic anthropologists describe a foundational concept called balanced reciprocity, a direct exchange where both parties expect a fair and immediate return of comparable value. This was the bedrock of trust that made early trade possible, but it was a system constantly tested by immense dangers. On land, a lone merchant was vulnerable to extortion by local chiefs demanding a toll for safe passage, or to outright theft by bandits lying in wait along remote stretches of the trail. At sea, piracy was a perpetual threat, with swift ships preying on heavily laden vessels carrying their precious cargo. Beyond human threats, there was the sheer unpredictability of nature itself. A sudden storm at sea or a rockslide in a mountain pass could erase a trader and their investment from existence. The uncertainty of distant markets added another layer of risk. A trader might travel for months to a far-off community only to find that demand for their goods had evaporated, or that a local artisan had developed a superior product, rendering their entire haul worthless. To navigate this volatile landscape, traders developed sophisticated strategies for risk mitigation. They formed partnerships, pooling resources with other merchants to afford larger caravans that could hire guards for protection. They diversified the goods they carried, mixing high-value luxury items with more mundane, staple products to ensure that even if some items failed to sell, others would cover the cost of the journey. The very act of traveling in a caravan was a form of insurance, safety in numbers against the perils of the wild. The rewards for those who succeeded, however, were transformative. Access to scarce resources was the most obvious prize. A trader who could reliably bring obsidian or cinnamon to a region that lacked it held a virtual monopoly. This generated immense wealth, which in turn bought social prestige and political influence. Perhaps the most valuable reward was knowledge. A trader returned home not just with exotic goods, but with intelligence on new agricultural techniques, emerging artistic styles, or shifting political alliances, information that could be leveraged for even greater advantage in the future. The Neolithic flint mines at Grimes Graves in England stand as a powerful monument to this ancient economics. Here, hundreds of shafts were dug deep into the earth using nothing but antler picks and stone hammers. The sheer scale of this operation, the immense labor investment, tells us this was not a casual hobby. This was organized production for a market. Miners were specializing in extracting high-quality flint, which was then knapped into tools and traded across the region. They were assuming the risk of a dangerous, underground endeavor for the reward of controlling a vital resource. This entrepreneurial spirit, this weighing of potential loss against potential gain, is a thread that connects the ancient flint miner to the modern startup founder. The very foundation of trade was this relentless drive to innovate in the face of uncertainty, a dynamic force that reshaped not just human societies, but the very planet they inhabited. The same trade routes that carried culture and innovation also left a lasting scar upon the earth. An ancient shipyard required not just skilled hands, but entire forests of tall, straight trees, felled to build the vessels that would connect continents. This was the environmental footprint of global connection, a reshaping of the planet that began thousands of years before the industrial era. Environmental historian J.R. McNeill reminds us that human exchange has always been a powerful ecological force, altering landscapes in profound and often unintended ways. The demand for specific trade goods led to the first large-scale industrial sites. The Neolithic flint mines of Grimes Graves in England, for instance, are a vast, pockmarked landscape, a testament to the intensive quarrying required to meet regional demand for high-quality tools. Similarly, the insatiable appetite for obsidian meant that entire volcanic flows were systematically stripped, while the Bronze Age thirst for copper and tin created some of the earliest and most polluted landscapes, with slag heaps and acidic runoff from smelting sites. This resource extraction had cascading effects. The Mediterranean world, fueled by trade in olive oil and wine, saw vast tracts of native forest cleared to make way for monoculture orchards and vineyards. This single-minded cultivation, while economically profitable, led to significant soil erosion, as the deep-rooted trees that once held the earth in place were replaced by shallow-rooted crops. The very paths of trade themselves contributed to the problem. Heavy caravan traffic along popular routes compacted the soil and stripped away protective vegetation, creating gullies and accelerating the desertification of marginal land. Perhaps the most profound ecological impact was the movement of species. Traders unknowingly became agents of biological exchange, carrying plants, animals, and even insects far beyond their native ranges. The spread of the black rat across the Roman world, stowing away on grain ships, is a classic example of an invasive species that disrupted local ecosystems. The trade in luxury goods could also push species to the brink. The demand for ivory from African elephants and Indian rhinoceroses led to localized depletions, forcing traders to venture ever deeper into unexplored territory to find their quarry, a pattern of resource exhaustion that feels strikingly modern. How did ancient societies manage these profound changes to their environment? Some developed early forms of resource management. There is evidence that Mesopotamian communities implemented rotational grazing to prevent overgrazing along trade routes. In the Indus Valley, sophisticated urban plumbing and drainage systems were designed to manage waste from a dense, trade-focused population. Other societies simply moved on, abandoning depleted resource areas and leaving the ecological scars behind them. This ancient legacy forces a powerful reflection. The environmental challenges of globalization are not a modern invention, but the latest chapter in a very old story. Our ancestors were already grappling with the trade-offs between economic gain and ecological health, a delicate balance that would directly influence the next great consequence of their interconnected world, the widening gap between the rich and the poor. The glitter of gold in a Varna chieftain's tomb was more than just wealth, it was a new kind of power. This profound shift is what archaeologist Timothy Earle identified as the engine of social change, where control over long-distance trade allowed certain individuals to amass influence unlike anything seen before. In societies where most people lived and died with similar possessions, the ability to acquire exotic goods created a visible, undeniable distinction. A leader who could provide rare obsidian for superior tools or shimmering cowrie shells for ceremonial dress was no longer just a first among equals. They were becoming something else entirely, a chief whose authority was cemented by their exclusive access to a wider world. This control over trade did more than just fill treasure houses, it funded the very architecture of power. The massive stone tombs and ceremonial platforms that appear in the archaeological record were not built by solitary effort. They required commanding the labor of many, a feat only possible for someone who could reward that labor with prized imports or who held a monopoly on the most effective resources. The grand earthen mounds of North America or the megalithic tombs of Europe stand as monuments to this new social reality, literally built on the foundations of trade networks. This system, however, created a fragile dependency, a community that specialized in producing a single valuable good, like a particular type of pottery or a highly prized salt, tied its entire fortune to the whims of distant markets. If the trade route shifted or demand dried up, that community could face immense hardship, its specialized knowledge suddenly worthless. This vulnerability made them reliant on the traders and chieftains who managed the connections, further deepening the social divide. The evidence for this transformation is starkly visible in places like the Varna Cemetery in Bulgaria. Here, a handful of individuals were buried in spectacular fashion, adorned with pounds of intricately worked gold that originated from sources hundreds of miles away. The vast majority of graves, however, contained simple stone tools or nothing at all. This cemetery is a frozen moment in time, capturing the very birth of economic inequality. It forces us to ask a difficult question. Does the exchange that connects us also inevitably create a hierarchy that separates us? Could these ancient networks have been structured around shared benefit rather than concentrated power? The answers are complex, written in the silent language of gold and stone. This immense power, concentrated in the hands of a few, would inevitably test the delicate balance between peaceful exchange and open conflict. A stone wall at Tel Hammokar, shattered by thousands of sling pellets, tells a violent story of a city besieged over 5,000 years ago. This was not a random act of destruction, but a calculated assault on a vital trade hub, a stark reminder that the pathways of commerce were also the first battle lines. Scholar Lawrence Keeley points to evidence like this as proof that prehistoric warfare was often a brutal business over resource control. When a community's wealth and survival depended on its access to a prized obsidian source or a key river crossing, the incentive to seize that control by force could override all else. Fortifications sprang up not just around cities, but around the very routes that connected them, turning neutral ground into contested territory. The competition for trade could splinter former allies and ignite long-standing rivalries, proving that the desire for connection had a dark and violent twin. Yet, this same system of exchange also held the seeds of its own salvation, a powerful counterforce to the drums of war. The very act of trade created a web of mutual need, an interdependence that made conflict a losing proposition. If your enemy is also your primary source of tin for bronze, or your only customer for fine pottery, then raiding their caravan is like setting your own warehouse on fire. This delicate balance between conflict and cooperation is one of history's oldest dramas, played out along every forgotten trail. A fascinating example of this peacemaking mechanism comes from the practice Herodotus called silent trade. In this system, one group would leave their goods at a traditional spot and withdraw. The other party would then approach, take the goods, and leave what they considered a fair exchange in return. This ritualized barter, conducted without a single word spoken, eliminated the potential for face-to-face misunderstanding or deception, allowing commerce to flourish between groups who might otherwise be enemies. Across the vast Pacific, the Lapita people offer another compelling model. Their expansion was not marked by the ruins of fortified settlements, but by the spread of a shared artistic style and a common toolkit found on islands thousands of miles apart. Their trade networks appear to have been sustained by a foundation of cultural commonality and mutual benefit, a peaceful web woven across the ocean. So, can we design our modern systems of exchange to deliberately favor cooperation over conflict? The ancient evidence suggests that the structure of the network itself is what matters most. When trade is built on balanced relationships and shared cultural understanding, it becomes a powerful glue. When it is based on monopoly and desperation, it becomes a spark. This complex interplay between commerce and power, between the hand that trades and the hand that fights, is a story written not only in stone and pottery, but in the very blueprint of our own biology, a genetic legacy waiting to be read. The genetic code of an ancient skeleton can reveal a journey its owner never recorded. A single tooth, excavated from a site in Oman, held a surprising story, its DNA pointing not to the local population but to the distant Indus Valley. This is the silent testimony carried in our very cells, a biological map of ancient movement that perfectly mirrors the trade routes suggested by pottery and artifacts. Pioneering geneticists like David Reich analyzed this ancient DNA, revealing waves of migration that did not just happen alongside trade. They were the very mechanism that made it possible. When people moved, they carried their goods, their technologies, and their languages with them, weaving a tapestry of connection that archaeology alone cannot fully reconstruct. The spread of major language families provides a parallel line of evidence, a cultural echo of these ancient pathways. The astonishing distribution of Austronesian languages, spoken from Madagascar to Easter Island, charts the course of the great seafaring expansion. Traders and settlers did not travel empty-handed. Their vessels were filled with goods and the words to describe them, planting their language on every new shore. Similarly, the vast reach of Indo-European languages from India to Iceland likely spread along the same steppe corridors that moved bronze and horses, carried by pastoralists and traders whose speech became the foundation for hundreds of modern tongues. We can even trace the movement of specific commodities through language itself. The word for silver, a metal highly prized in antiquity, appears in similar forms across many Eurasian languages, suggesting the term traveled with the precious metal along these early exchange networks. Of course, these tools have their limitations. Genetic mixing can result from many events, not just peaceful trade, and languages can spread through conquest or large-scale migration. The key is in the convergence of evidence. A compelling case is that of the Tarim Basin mummies in Western China. These individuals, dating back thousands of years, were found with physical features and woven textiles that seemed European. Initial theories suggested they were long-distance migrants from the West, yet when their DNA was finally sequenced, it revealed a more complex story. They were not recent arrivals, but a deeply isolated, ancient population, whose unique culture nonetheless incorporated weaving styles and technologies that indicated some form of contact and exchange with distant groups. This is the true power of the interdisciplinary approach. Genetics, linguistics, and archaeology are not competing narratives, but different voices in the same chorus, each revealing a part of the truth. When the genetic evidence of South Asian people in Oman aligns with the pottery from Indus Valley ships found there, and when the spread of a word for a traded item follows the archaeological trail of the object itself, we can be far more confident in redrawing our maps of the ancient world. These methods open entirely new windows into the depth of prehistoric connectivity, allowing us to see the individual people within the vast networks. This holistic view inevitably pushes our curiosity further, prompting us to ask what other aspects of ancient life were shaped by this constant flow of contact. How did the art and symbols of one culture, carried along these routes, find new meaning and inspire fresh creativity in another? A Mesopotamian artisan carefully paints a strange, leonine creature onto the rim of a clay vessel, a beast he has never seen but knows only from the descriptions of a trader from the East. This was the silent, profound exchange of art, where symbols crossed cultural boundaries as easily as spices or stones, creating a shared visual language that spanned continents. Art historian Henry Frankfurt meticulously traced the journey of the Master of Animals motif, a powerful figure shown grasping two beasts which originated in the art of ancient Mesopotamia. This symbol of control over the natural world did not stay put. It traveled along the trade routes, appearing centuries later on the seals of the distant Indus Valley civilization, a clear testament to the flow of ideas alongside goods. The material itself could dictate a new artistic form. The deep, celestial blue of lapis lazuli, mined only in the remote mountains of Afghanistan, became a prized import for Egyptian artisans. They ground it into a brilliant pigment to adorn the tombs of pharaohs, transforming a raw, traded material into a sacred color meant to represent the heavens themselves. This was more than simple imitation, it was creative adaptation. When Greek art, carried by the conquests of Alexander the Great, met the spiritual traditions of Buddhism in Central Asia, something remarkable happened. The serene faces of the Buddha began to take on the idealized, realistic features of Greek gods, a style known as Greco-Buddhist art that would eventually influence statues all the way to China and Japan. Even in the remote islands of Japan, the distinct chord-marked pottery of the Jomon period shows subtle influences from the mainland, with new shapes and decorative patterns suggesting that aesthetic ideas were crossing the sea. How did this constant blending of artistic styles actually foster innovation? It forced artisans to see the world through a new lens. Confronted with a foreign symbol or an unfamiliar technique, they had to reinterpret it, blending it with their own traditions to create something entirely novel. This cross-pollination was a relentless engine of creativity. The aesthetic legacy of these networks reminds us that beauty was one of the most powerful commodities ever traded, a universal language that could bridge any divide. Yet, the very forces that wove this intricate web of connection would one day begin to pull it apart, setting the stage for a great transformation. A once bustling river valley, rich with trade, grows silent as the rains fail and the old pathways fade into memory. The decline of these early networks was not a single event, but a slow unraveling, driven by forces both environmental and human. Historian Joseph Tainter offers a compelling lens for this process, suggesting that societies, and by extension their trade systems, can reach a point of diminishing returns. The energy required to maintain complex networks, especially in the face of mounting challenges, can eventually become too great, leading to a simplification or a complete collapse of the system. One of the most powerful drivers of this change was the climate. Around 5,000 years ago, the Sahara began its transition from a land of savannas and lakes to the vast desert we know today. This gradual drying process disrupted the delicate ecology that supported the early Trans-Saharan routes, forcing communities to abandon their settlements and severing the links that had connected North Africa to its southern neighbors for centuries. The trade in goods like exotic woods and vibrant pigments dwindled, demonstrating how a shifting environment could erase a continent-spanning network from the map. Political upheaval was just as destructive. In Mesopotamia, the great city of Ur, once a hub of maritime trade with the Indus Valley, saw its influence wane. Archaeological layers show a decline in imported goods, like the distinctively etched carnelian beads from the Indus, correlating with a period of political fragmentation and conflict among rival city-states. As central authority crumbled, the security required for long-distance trade vanished, and the routes that had once pulsed with economic life grew still. The very success of trade could also sow the seeds of its own transformation. The rise of powerful, centralized states often led to the monopolization of commerce. Where once many independent traders and villages had participated in a decentralized network, now a royal administration could control the flow of luxury goods, redirecting trade to serve the interests of a narrow elite and fundamentally altering the patterns of exchange that had existed for millennia. Yet the story is not solely one of endings. It is also a powerful lesson in adaptation. In Southeast Asia, for example, we see a remarkable shift from overland to maritime trade. As shipbuilding and navigational skills advanced, the sea became a more efficient highway than the difficult jungle trails. Communities that had been inland intermediaries reinvented themselves as coastal ports, their fortunes now tied to the winds and tides rather than the paths of caravans. A poignant case study comes from the Nordic Bronze Age. Around 500 years before the Common Era, this vibrant network, which had circulated Baltic amber and sophisticated metalwork across northern Europe, appears to collapse. The evidence from bog deposits and tree rings points to a dramatic climatic deterioration, a period of colder, wetter weather that would have shortened growing seasons and made sea voyages perilous. In the face of such hardship, the complex social structures that supported long-distance trade likely fragmented, and the network reverted to smaller, more localized exchanges. What can the life cycles of these ancient networks teach us about our own global economy? They show us that no system, no matter how vast or sophisticated, is permanent. Their resilience was tested by climate change, political instability, and technological disruption, challenges that feel deeply familiar today. Their fate reminds us that adaptation is the key to longevity, and that the true legacy of a network may not be its permanence, but its ability to transform, leaving behind a cultural and genetic imprint that would shape the world to come. The first written contract, pressed into a clay tablet in Mesopotamia, did not invent trade. It simply gave a permanent voice to a conversation that had been whispered along footpaths and across campfires for thousands of years. This was the moment the invisible network became visible, its ancient patterns hardening into the familiar trade routes of recorded history. The concept that explains this remarkable continuity is called path dependence. The earliest trails, chosen for a reliable water source or a safe mountain pass, established a corridor of movement that became self-reinforcing. Generation after generation used the same paths, building way stations and forming alliances until the route itself became an institution. The amber road of prehistoric Europe never truly vanished. Its river valleys and overland trails were simply paved over by Roman roads and later became the trade arteries of medieval Hanseatic League cities, still moving northern goods southward. The Indian Ocean network is an even more stunning example of persistence. The same monsoon winds that guided prehistoric Austronesian and Arabian sailors were still being used by Portuguese carracks and British East Indiamen thousands of years later, the ports of call shifting but the fundamental maritime highway remaining unchanged. The institutions of trade also show this direct lineage. The standardized stone weights of the Indus Valley civilization find their echo in the meticulously regulated weights and measures of Babylonian marketplaces. The prehistoric system of clay tokens sealed in a bulla, a three-dimensional contract, evolved into the cuneiform script on those Mesopotamian tablets, formalizing credit and obligations that were once a matter of memory and trust. Nowhere is this legacy more clear than with the Phoenicians. Celebrated as the great merchants of the ancient Mediterranean, they did not emerge from a vacuum. Their coastal cities like Byblos and Tyre were built upon the foundations of much older, prehistoric Levantine trade networks that had already been moving cedar wood, olive oil, and resins between Egypt, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia for centuries. The Phoenicians simply inherited this deep-rooted system, refined it with their shipbuilding and alphabetic innovations, and scaled it across the entire sea. How much of our modern global economy is rooted in these ancient exchanges? The answer is nearly all of it. The very idea of a market, of credit, of standardized value, and of long-distance shipping logistics was not invented in the modern era but was field-tested and perfected over countless generations in the prehistoric world. Recognizing this immense continuity forces a profound shift in perspective. Our interconnected world is not a recent invention, but the latest expression of a human impulse to reach out and connect that is as old as humanity itself. This long arc of exchange, stretching from those first obsidian blades to the digital networks of today, invites a final reflection on what this forgotten history truly means for us. These forgotten networks reveal a profound truth about our species. Long before empires or written contracts, we were connected by a web of exchange driven by a deep human need for more than just survival. It was a drive for better tools, for beauty, for meaning, and for contact with a world beyond the horizon. From the volcanic glass of Anatolia to the golden amber of the Baltic and the sacred jade of the Kunlun Mountains, these goods were more than commodities. They were the physical threads weaving together the human story, carrying ideas, technologies, and beliefs across impossible distances. Our ancestors demonstrated breathtaking ingenuity, mastering deserts, oceans, and mountains not with advanced machinery, but with intimate knowledge of the stars, the land, and the delicate art of building trust. They laid the foundational stones for our modern globalized world, proving that the impulse to connect is ancient and deeply ingrained. This forces us to see trade not as a dry economic activity, but as a fundamental cultural force. It shaped our societies, spurred our greatest innovations, and defined our shared identities. The anthropologist Mary Helms captured it perfectly when she noted that long-distance trade goods are not merely material objects, but are condensed symbols of the outside world. A single cowrie shell or a polished piece of obsidian was a story, a piece of a distant universe made tangible. That legacy of connection is all around us, hidden in plain sight. It is in the food we eat, the words we speak, and the very ideas we hold dear. We are the inheritors of these ancient pathways, so the next time you hold an object from a far-off place, consider the invisible journey it represents, and the countless hands that have passed such treasures along for millennia. The mysteries of our shared past are still being uncovered. If you want to join the search for more of history's enigmas, subscribe for more deep dives into the unknown. And we would love to hear from you. Which of these forgotten trade networks resonated most with your own sense of wonder? Share your thoughts in the comments below.